Just before we get started with today's video, I do want to mention another channel that I host called Mega Project. Mega Projects is a channel all about mankind's greatest achievements, where I take a deep look at incredible buildings, projects, structures, and more. Whether it's the world's most impressive skyscrapers, the International Space Station, or Chernobyl's sarcophagus, I cover it all. New videos come out a couple of times a week on Mega Projects, so if you think it could be for you, please do head over and subscribe. There is a link in the description below, and let's get into it. Unfortunately, this is the situation that Spanish people are living in these days because of coronavirus. A virus that is shaking the country in a way that, until just a few months ago, would have seemed to us to only belong in an over-the-top Hollywood production. Sadly, at the time of making this video, more than 200,000 infections and more than 20,000 deaths have been registered in Spain. And the worst part is, there are still several extremely tough weeks ahead for Spain. These are the sort of figures that can make your hair stand on end. In order to give you an idea, during the final days of March, the coronavirus has increased daily mortality in Spain by more than 70%. That is, deaths that occur for any reason at all. And obviously, although it is the worst part, human tragedy is not the only consequence of this crisis. Since the second week of March, all shops except for supermarkets, pharmacies, and some other essential establishments have been closed. For example, all bars, restaurants, clothing stores, and shopping centers are shut. And of course, retail and hospitality businesses are not the only ones affected. Companies of all kinds, including large industrial groups, have also been forced to stop their day-to-day activities. This is something that has caused hundreds of thousands of Spaniards to be now put out of work. On top of the stress of confinement, they have faced dismissals, or at best, temporary layoffs.
Temporary layoffs already affect 1.5 million workers. El País.
And yes, many of these workers, the vast majority, will probably get their jobs back once this health crisis is finally behind us. But for many others, this collapse is sure to mean losing their jobs permanently. Today, there's a lot of uncertainty about what may happen. Never before has the switch that stops a country's economic and social activity been flipped so suddenly. There just isn't any precedent.
Production activity plummets by 66% because of uncertainty and declining orders. La Vanguardia.
So, how did it come to this? Not long ago, we talked to you here on VisualPolitik about China's handling of the whole thing. We told you how China publicly declared the epidemic situation in the second half of January. Within just a few days, during the first half of February, many Asian countries had already begun to put in place serious measures to contain the possible spread of the virus. However, in the West, well, things were very different. Simply put, nothing was done until well into March. And the slow, clumsy reaction from countries such as Spain has had grave consequences.
Raincoats, driving goggles, and shower caps. Doctors from Madrid on the edge. Despair is beginning to be felt by all health workers. Garbage bags, plastics, and homemade material to fill hospital shortages. Promised resources don't come. El Confidencial.
In this video, we will tell you what Spain did to become the country with the third highest number of coronavirus cases in the world. This is a story of politicians, media, half-truths, and many suspicions. So let's get into it.
Queda otorgada la confianza al candidato Don Pedro Sánchez Pérez Castejón.
My friend, we started badly.
2020 promised to be a good year for the world. Markets seemed optimistic after many swings, threats, and trade wars. Unemployment in the United States was at a historic low, and for example in Spain, unemployment continued to reduce while forecasts for economic growth were fairly positive. On January 1st, 2020, what no one could have imagined was that a horrible year was about to begin. Nevertheless, in that same month of January, China already had hundreds of confirmed cases of coronavirus. In fact, it is suspected that real cases could have already been well into the thousands. That is precisely why the Chinese regime finally had to accept the epidemic and take drastic measures such as decreeing a blockade and an absolute quarantine throughout Hubei province, a province of about 60 million people. And that's not all. The rest of China was idling. People stopped being able to take freely to the streets. Simply and plainly put, the world's largest factory had stopped. A few days later, the World Health Organization considered this epidemic and the resulting pandemic a global health emergency.
January 31st, 2020. Coronavirus declared global health emergency by World Health Organization, BBC.
And many of you will think, but Simon, with all of these alarm signals, it would be normal that in countries like Spain, seeing the havoc such a situation could cause, there would have been some concern and some preparation, right? Well, yes, you're not wrong, but unfortunately, no, none of that happened. What's more, the opposite was true.
Y lo que tenemos que tener en cuenta es que lo más peligroso ahora es el miedo, más que el propio virus, que como digo, normalmente lo que deja como secuelas es los síntomas menores incluso que los de una gripe.
Tenemos una situación en España en la que a nivel de país se pueda pensar en una transmisión generalizada descontrolada, ni muchísimo menos.
As you see, everything was fine in Spain. The Spaniards weren't going to get it, no way. As one of the leaders of the Vox party, the country's third largest political organization, said, the Spanish antibodies would defeat those damn Chinese viruses. Yes, he really said that out loud. It's quite incredible. We should also note that it seems that this perception was also shared in some way by the Ministry of Health. Both Minister Salvador Illa and the head of the Coordination Center for Health Alerts and Emergencies, Fernando Simon, both seemed to turn a blind eye to what was happening much closer than China in the lands of their Mediterranean neighbor, Italy. Look, by the 29th of February, Italy had already surpassed 1,000 known cases of SARS coronavirus 2 infection. Infections that barely a week later had already exceeded 5,000. Despite this, and being two very similar countries with close relations to each other, the Spanish government continued to do virtually nothing. In fact, even when it was known that the coronavirus had already reached Spanish soil, no controls were established at airports, nor were trains, buses, or stations disinfected, nor were actions taken to purchase medical equipment and materials just in case. Nothing at all was done. I mean, come on, it's normal to do at least some of these things when you know there's an unknown virus out there, a virus that's a nightmare for your neighbor and that has been able to stop the Chinese economy dead in its tracks. Even at the most critical moments, the problem was not what Spain didn't do, but that their actions made everything worse.
Yo creo que cada uno tiene que expresar sus ideas como considere y que si considera que tiene que estar en una manifestación, que estén, si considera que tiene que estar, que no estén. Si mi hijo me pregunta si puede ir, le voy a decir que haga lo que quiera.
¿Qué le diría usted a una mujer que está dudando en ir o no a la manifestación del 8 de marzo?
Que le va la vida. Que le va su vida.
I know this might seem a bit controversial, but I'm sorry, we wouldn't be honest if we didn't say it. With all the data available concerning March the 8th, 2020, it will go down in history as the date that showed that the government of Spain ignored the coronavirus. You see, for days and days, and despite the fact that the authorities knew, they had to know since the virus was moving freely through much of the country, the Spanish government devoted itself to downplaying the risk with the apparent intention that the news would not affect the rallies that were to be held on International Women's Day. Demonstrations that in Spain are attended in large numbers and that have become a political battleground, a very important event for the two parties that form the current government, PSOE, the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, and Podemos. And this is where we all have to ask ourselves a question. How laudable can a cause be when it endangers public health? Can a government look the other way in an epidemic in order to maintain its political agenda? That's not all. The same day, rallies, concerts, sporting events, and many other events were held throughout Spain, where literally thousands and thousands of people were exposed to the infection. At the Vox Party rally in Madrid alone, 9,000 people were exposed to the virus in an enclosed space on March the 8th. To top it all off, a few days later, it became known that half of the party's hierarchy were infected. Yes, that's right. It was a marathon of hugging, shaking hands, and kissing dozens and dozens of people, many of them who were elderly. It's a great idea, wasn't it? And no, it's no use pretending that at this time the whole coronavirus thing was an unknown threat. Not at all. Not only was there a strong and clear international alert from the WHO, it was also known what was happening in Italy. Meanwhile, in Spain itself, more than 600 cases had already been reported, diagnosed, and 17 people had already died from coronavirus.
The socialist-led government of Pedro Sanchez reacted late and clumsily. The country lacked essential equipment. Ventilators, protective clothing for doctors, and coronavirus tests are still only just being sourced. Giles Tremlett, The Guardian's correspondent based in Spain.
But at this point, the burning question is, was the Spanish government's lack of action a miscalculation or something premeditated? Well, that's the question we're going to try to answer here, so let's continue.
The turning point for the entire country.
The Spanish government did not try too hard to gloss over this. One day, exactly one day, was all it took for them to change their discourse and get to work on trying to slow the expansion of coronavirus. I mean, put another way, until March the 8th, the government was encouraging people to take to the streets, and just a day later, on March the 9th, suddenly, suspiciously, the coronavirus problem became a mega problem.
Bien, los datos indican un cambio a peor de la evolución de la enfermedad en España. Básicamente se produjo ayer domingo por la tarde.
Just one day later. Incredible.
Madrid regional government orders the shutdown of all educational centers during the next 2 weeks. Cadena SER.
And it's important to note that the first measures were not encouraged by the central government of Spain, but by the autonomous communities, by regional governments, that, by the way, up to that point had done basically nothing. And indeed, the truth is that at first, these measures lacked even a minimum coordination between regional governments and the national government. For example, the lack of restrictions after educational activity was suspended led many teachers and university students to return to their home regions with the consequent risk of spreading the contagion across the country. Something similar also happened when President Pedro Sanchez announced the state of alarm more than 24 hours before implementing it. It was a disaster. But at this point, there is a question you might be asking. Okay, but Simon, was this really just to save a political rally in Madrid? If so, why didn't regional governments, for example those controlled by opposition parties, do something to protect their people? Well, obviously, there's never only one reason, and this case was no different. Many interests were at play here. It's clear Spain is a tourist powerhouse. It's a Mediterranean country with lots of sun and kilometers of beaches, as well as good food and cheap alcohol. It's basically a paradise for millions of European tourists. In fact, in 2019 alone, Spain received 84 million tourists from the rest of the world. 84 million tourists in a country of just over 45 million. So now you probably get an idea of the importance that tourism has in the Spanish economy. We're talking about more than 12% of its GDP and 2 million jobs. So why are we telling you about all this in a video about coronavirus? Well, basically because there are a lot of clues that tourism has had a lot to do with some politicians, especially regional politicians, preferring to look the other way. Why risk stopping the engine that powers the Spanish economy because of a simple flu? Why cut your nose off to spite your face? Well, that's what a lot of Spanish politicians, from the central government to municipal governments, even regional ones, must have thought. No one wanted to rock the boat. But given where Spain is, now the question is, what has been the cost of not taking action? Will there be political accountability for this whole disaster?
Todos hubiéramos actuado de forma distinta, pero se da la circunstancia de que cuando se actuó no sabíamos lo que sabemos hoy.
Self-criticism? Say what?
In all of the story, there were only two possibilities. Either act rapidly, accepting the severity of the problem and enforce the measures from the beginning to prevent the spread of the virus, or do nothing and find yourself in an extremely dire situation like the one facing several countries at the time of posting this video. Unfortunately, in Spain, the second option was chosen. And no, it wasn't because they weren't warned. Look at this.
20th of January, China confirms new coronavirus spreads from humans to humans. The New York Times. The 9th of February, coronavirus deaths exceed SARS fatalities in 2003. BBC. 25th of February, coronavirus. World must prepare for pandemic, says WHO. BBC.
Well, this was published information, so the Spanish government must have had even more expert advice, especially given that Fernando Simon, the coordinator of the Health Alerts and Emergencies Coordination Center, is part of the Committee of the European Centers for Diseases, the same institution that, as early as the 2nd of March, discouraged mass event meetings. Yes, that's right. The same man who said he would tell his son to go to the 8th of March rally in Madrid if he wanted to was part of the European Centre that 6 days earlier discouraged mass meetings in order to prevent infection. So, is it just me, or does this all smell rather fishy? Well, that's not the end of it. Within the various structures of the state, there were those who took the risks seriously. And of course, the government didn't take kindly to them.
Head of prevention of the National Police who designed the protocol against the coronavirus is dismissed. El Mundo.
We are talking about a manager who, as early as January, warned his superiors of the risk posed by coronavirus to the police force and designed a plan of protective measures that did not sit well with the upper spheres of power. But still, there's more. I'm sorry about what's coming now, but along with the politicians, the media didn't act wisely either. In fact, they delightedly joined that campaign of ridiculing the importance of coronavirus and even argued in some programs that the common flu was more dangerous than coronavirus itself.
Es un tipo de gripe nueva, es verdad. La mayor parte de estos infectados se están recuperando en su casa como si fuera una gripe común, pero que, chico, parece que se extiende más el alarmismo que los datos.
Of course, all this misinformation, together with the attitude of the government, not only caused inaction from the state and local authorities, but is also likely the reason many people did not take the threat seriously and therefore didn't modify their behavior in ways that may have helped slow the virus. And when it comes to not taking action, we can talk about medical supplies such as rapid tests to diagnose infections, a test that now urgently needs to be bought.
Ya se ha materializado la compra y la puesta en marcha de los test rápidos, algo muy importante. Se tratan de test fiables, homologados, y esto es muy importante. Es muy importante porque deben contar con todas las garantías sanitarias. Tenemos ya comprometidas 640.000 unidades y vamos a llegar muy pronto al millón.
But it was a case of too little, too late. In a ridiculous comedy of errors, the Spanish government bought hundreds of thousands of defective tests from a Shenzhen company that was not even certified by the Chinese government.
China claims that Spain purchased the failed tests from an unlicensed manufacturer. The Chinese embassy in Spain states that the batch of failed tests that Spain purchased was obtained from a company that was not on the Chinese government's list of official vendors. El Confidencial.
So you see just one disaster after another. In a nutshell, this has been the course of events that explains to a large extent what has led Spain to become one of the largest epicenters of coronavirus in the world. I think we can better understand the differences between countries that have managed to limit the damage of the virus, such as South Korea or Taiwan, and the case of Spain. But now over to you. Do you think that someone responsible for such a dire performance should share the responsibility and resign or leave their posts? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, and I really hope you found that video interesting, informative. If you did, please do hit like. Also, if you'd like more from me, please do check out that Megastructures channel that I'm going to link to below. And thank you for watching.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.